The coffee shop buzzed with its usual evening crowd when Sarah Martinez slipped the crumpled napkin across the counter to Jake, the night shift manager. Her hands trembled as she wrote those 5 words that would change everything. "He's coming tonight. Help me." Jake had seen Sarah come in every Tuesday for months, always ordering the same black coffee, always sitting in the corner booth where she could watch both entrances. But tonight was different. Tonight, fear radiated from her like heat from asphalt. Sarah's story wasn't unique, but it was hers. 3 months earlier, she'd finally found the courage to leave Marcus, her abusive boyfriend of 2 years. The restraining order was supposed to protect her, but paper shields don't stop determined predators. Marcus had been calling, following, waiting. Each violation reported, each police report filed, each promise from the system that they'd handle it. But tonight, Sarah knew the system wouldn't be fast enough. Jake studied the napkin, then looked at Sarah's bruised wrist peeking out from her sleeve. He'd grown up in this neighborhood, knew its rhythms and its people. More importantly, he knew who really kept the streets safe when the law fell short. His older brother Danny rode with the Bandidos MC, and Jake had heard the stories of what happened to men who hurt women and children in their territory. Without hesitation, Jake pulled out his phone and sent a text that would mobilize a brotherhood forged in loyalty and tempered by justice. The message was simple: need the club, woman in danger, tonight. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with responses from riders across the city. The Bandidos didn't advertise their protective work, didn't seek recognition or praise. They simply acted when action was needed. If you believe some fights are worth taking, hit that subscribe button and join a community that stands for something real. The engine roar you're about to hear isn't just noise. It's the sound of justice rolling down the street. Danny Martinez received his brother's text while working late in his auto shop, grease under his fingernails and concern etching lines around his eyes. The Bandidos MC operated on a simple code: protect those who couldn't protect themselves, especially women and children. This wasn't about playing hero or seeking glory. It was about community responsibility that ran deeper than blood. Within 20 minutes, Danny's phone was buzzing with confirmations from chapter members across 3 counties. The response was swift and methodical. Road Captain Miguel Santos coordinated from the clubhouse, his military background evident in how he organized the operation. Sergeant-at-Arms Tony Rodriguez gathered intelligence on Marcus Thompson, Sarah's stalker. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture: 2 previous restraining orders from other women, a history of escalating violence, and a pattern of behavior that law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to stop effectively. President Carlos Diesel Hernandez made the final call from his kitchen table, where he'd been helping his daughter with homework. At 52, Diesel had seen enough domestic violence cases to know that tonight could be Sarah's last if they didn't intervene. The club's approach wasn't about vigilante justice. It was about creating consequences where none existed. They'd tried working with police before, but bureaucracy moved slowly, while violence moved fast. By 9 p.m., 12 Bandidos were rolling through the city streets, their engines creating a symphony of purpose. Each rider carried years of experience, not just in motorcycle culture, but in reading dangerous situations. They weren't thugs or criminals. They were mechanics, construction workers, veterans, fathers and sons who'd chosen to stand between predators and their prey when society's safety nets failed. The convoy moved with precision through Sarah's neighborhood, engines throttling down to reduce noise but maintaining the unmistakable presence that announced their arrival. Tonight, Marcus Thompson would learn that some women weren't as alone as he believed. Marcus Thompson sat in his rusted Honda Civic 3 blocks from Sarah's apartment, scrolling through her social media profiles on his phone. For weeks, he'd been studying her patterns, learning her schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to remind her that restraining orders were just paper. In his twisted logic, Sarah belonged to him, and her attempt to build a new life was nothing more than temporary rebellion that needed correction. The restraining order had been a joke from the beginning. A few court appearances, some stern warnings from a judge who'd never lived in fear, and paperwork that meant nothing to a man who'd already decided the rules didn't apply to him. Marcus had violated it 12 times in 3 months. late-night phone calls, following her to work, leaving flowers on her car with notes that promised he'd never let her go. Each violation resulted in police reports that seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. Tonight felt different to Marcus, though he couldn't identify why. Maybe it was the way Sarah had looked over her shoulder when leaving the coffee shop, or the nervous energy that seemed to follow her like a shadow. He'd been planning this confrontation for weeks, rehearsing what he'd say to convince her to come home and what he'd do if she refused. The baseball bat in his back seat wasn't for persuasion, it was for compliance. What Marcus didn't understand was that predators like him operated on fear and isolation. They counted on their victims being alone, being afraid, being convinced that no one cared enough to help. His entire strategy depended on Sarah facing him without allies, without protection, without hope. He'd built his power on her powerlessness, his control on her helplessness. As Marcus started his engine and began driving towards Sarah's apartment building, he had no idea that 12 motorcycles were already positioning themselves throughout the neighborhood. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the isolation he'd used as a weapon was about to become his own prison. The Bandidos positioned themselves with military precision throughout Sarah's neighborhood. Danny Martinez and 2 prospects took the north entrance, while Road Captain Santos covered the south exit with 3 patched members. President Diesel positioned himself directly across from Sarah's building, his bike parked between 2 cars where he could observe without being obvious. This wasn't their first protective operation, and experience had taught them that preparation prevented chaos. Sarah waited in her 3rd-floor apartment, curtains drawn and lights dimmed. Jake had called to tell her help was coming, though she wasn't sure what form that help would take. She'd heard stories about the Bandidos. Some people called them dangerous, others called them protectors. Tonight, she was hoping for the latter. Her hands shook as she double-checked the locks on her door and windows, knowing that locks had never stopped Marcus before. The neighborhood seemed unusually quiet, as if the streets themselves sensed the approaching confrontation. Dogs stopped barking, porch lights flickered on, and residents seemed to instinctively understand that something significant was about to unfold. The Bandidos had that effect. Their presence changed the energy of a place, made predators nervous, and gave victims hope. Miguel Santos monitored police scanner frequencies from his position, ensuring they wouldn't be interrupted by well-meaning officers who might complicate the situation. The club had learned to work around law enforcement rather than against them, understanding that their methods existed in grey areas that courts couldn't navigate. Tonight's operation would be clean, precise, and leave no room for legal complications. As Marcus's Honda turned onto Sarah's street, 12 sets of eyes tracked his movement. The trap was set, the Brotherhood was ready, and a man who'd terrorized a woman for months was about to discover that some neighborhoods had their own justice system. The engine sounds that filled the night air weren't random noise. They were a coordinated symphony of protection. Marcus pulled into the parking lot behind Sarah's building, his confidence growing with each step toward her apartment. He'd made this walk in his mind 100 times, rehearsing his words and planning his approach. The baseball bat felt comfortable in his grip as he climbed the stairs to her floor. In his twisted reality, he was simply reclaiming what belonged to him, correcting a mistake that had gone on too long. The first sign that tonight would be different came when Marcus reached the 2nd-floor landing. The sound of motorcycle engines filled the air around the building, not passing through but idling, waiting, surrounding. He paused, looking out the stairwell window to see bikes positioned at every exit. For the first time in months, Marcus felt the cold touch of fear that Sarah had lived with every day since leaving him. President Diesel's voice cut through the night air, amplified by the building's acoustics. "Marcus Thompson, you need to come down here and have a conversation with us." The words weren't shouted or threatening. They carried the weight of absolute certainty. 12 engines revved in unison, creating a sound that vibrated through the building's walls and settled into Marcus's bones like ice water. Sarah heard the exchange from her apartment and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not the false security of restraining orders or police promises, but the real protection that came from people willing to act. She moved to her window and saw the Bandidos positioned throughout the parking lot, their bikes forming a perimeter that transformed her building into a fortress. Marcus stood frozen on the stairwell, understanding for the first time that he was no longer the hunter. The baseball bat in his hands suddenly felt inadequate against 12 men who'd made protecting women their personal mission. Comment below if you think Marcus is finally about to face real consequences for his actions, because this brotherhood doesn't negotiate with predators. Marcus descended the stairs slowly, each step taking him further from his fantasy of control and closer to a reality he'd never considered. The Bandidos waited in formation, their presence filling the parking lot like a wall of leather and steel. President Diesel stood at the center, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the weight of every woman who'd ever been terrorized by men like Marcus. This wasn't about violence. It was about consequences. "You've been told to stay away from Sarah," Diesel said, his voice calm but carrying undertones that made Marcus's hands shake. "Restraining orders, police warnings, court orders, you ignored them all. Tonight that changes." The other Bandidos remained silent, their engines idling, creating a soundtrack of inevitability. Marcus looked around desperately, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Road Captain Santos stepped forward, holding a manila folder. "We know about Jennifer Walsh, your ex from 2019. We know about Maria Santos, who moved 3 states away because of you. We know about the pattern, Marcus. You target women, you isolate them, you terrorize them until they break or flee." The folder contained photographs, police reports, and testimonies that painted a picture of systematic predation. The conversation that followed wasn't negotiation, it was education. The Bandidos explained to Marcus exactly what would happen if he ever contacted Sarah again, if he violated the restraining order again, if he even drove through this neighborhood again. They spoke in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, using language that bypassed legal technicalities and went straight to primal understanding. When they finished, Marcus was no longer the confident stalker who'd climbed those stairs. He was a broken man who finally understood that his reign of terror had ended. The Bandidos hadn't laid a finger on him, but they dismantled his power completely, permanently, and irreversibly. Sarah watched from her window as Marcus stumbled back to his car, his shoulders shaking and his confidence shattered. The transformation was remarkable. The man who'd terrorized her for months now looked like a frightened child who'd been caught stealing. The Bandidos remained in position until Marcus's Honda disappeared into the night, their engines creating a protective barrier between Sarah's new life and her violent past. President Diesel climbed the stairs to Sarah's apartment, removing his helmet to reveal a face weathered by years of standing between predators and prey. "Mom, he won't be bothering you again," he said simply. Sarah invited him in for coffee, wanting to understand why these men had risked themselves for a stranger. Diesel's explanation was straightforward. Because someone has to. Because the system failed you. Because no woman should live in fear. The conversation that followed revealed the deeper truth about the Bandidos' protective work. They weren't vigilantes seeking violence. They were community guardians, filling gaps left by overwhelmed law enforcement and inadequate legal systems. Diesel showed Sarah letters from dozens of women they'd helped over the years, testimonials that spoke of lives saved and futures restored. Their work wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about basic human decency. Over the following weeks, Sarah began rebuilding her life without the constant shadow of fear. She returned to school, started dating again, and slowly reclaimed the pieces of herself that Marcus had tried to destroy. The Bandidos checked on her periodically, not intrusively but consistently, ensuring that her safety remained intact and her confidence continued growing. The ripple effects extended beyond Sarah's individual case. Word spread through the community about what had happened, and other women began reaching out for help. The Bandidos found themselves coordinating with domestic violence shelters, working with counselors, and creating networks of protection that extended far beyond their motorcycle club. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood before a community meeting, sharing her story with an audience that included police officers, social workers, and domestic violence advocates. The Bandidos sat in the back row, uncomfortable with the attention, but present to support the woman they'd helped save. Sarah's testimony wasn't just about her individual rescue, it was about the power of community action when institutions fail. The partnership that emerged from that night transformed how the city addressed domestic violence. The Bandidos began working officially with law enforcement, providing protective services that bridged gaps in the legal system. Their approach, direct, immediate, and uncompromising, complemented traditional law enforcement methods and created consequences for predators who'd learned to game the system. Marcus Thompson never contacted Sarah again. In fact, he left the state entirely, understanding that his pattern of abuse had been permanently disrupted. The Bandidos' intervention hadn't just protected one woman. It had prevented future victims from experiencing the terror that Sarah had endured. Sometimes justice comes through courts and legal proceedings, but sometimes it arrives on motorcycles with men who've decided that enough is enough. The coffee shop, where Sarah first wrote her desperate plea, became an unofficial safe haven, with Jake training other employees to recognize signs of domestic violence and connect victims with resources. The napkin message that started everything was framed behind the counter, not as a trophy but as a reminder that help can come from unexpected places when people choose to care. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share this video with someone who needs to know that they're not alone, that communities still exist where people protect each other. The Brotherhood rolls on, one rescue at a time, proving that sometimes the most powerful force against darkness is simply refusing to look away.